Hattie Calloway was 70 years old, and she had never owned anything larger than a suitcase. So when a lawyer from Virginia called to tell her that a woman she had never met had left her a 52-acre apple farm in the Shenandoah Valley, she did the only thing that made sense. She laughed. Then she hung up the phone. The lawyer called again the next morning, and the morning after that. People in town thought she was out of her mind for even considering it. A retired school librarian with bad knees and no family driving 400 miles to claim an orchard from a dead stranger. But what none of them knew was that Vivian Ashworth had spent the last 30 years of her life searching for exactly one person, and that person was Hattie. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. That way you won't miss the next one. Now let's go back to where it all began. Hattie Calloway learned early that love was something other people received. She was 3 years old when the state of Pennsylvania placed her in her first foster home, a narrow brick row house in Scranton, where the radiators clanked through the night, and the woman who fed her never once used her name. She was called the girl. For 2 years that was enough. Then the placement ended the way placements always did, without warning and without explanation. A social worker arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, helped Hattie pack a garbage bag with her clothes, and drove her across town to another house, another family, another set of rules. She would memorize just in time to leave. By the age of 10, Hattie had lived in 6 homes. By 13, she had stopped counting. Each one followed the same pattern: arrival, adjustment, a few weeks or months of fragile normalcy, then the slow familiar unraveling. A new baby in the family, a change in finances, a parent who drank too much, a caseworker who decided a different placement would be a better fit. The reasons varied, the result never did. Hattie would pack her things, climb into the back seat of a state vehicle, and watch another house shrink in the rearview mirror. She never cried during those rides, not once. Crying, she had learned, changed nothing. By 16, she had grown tall and quiet, the kind of girl teachers described as no trouble on progress reports, which really meant invisible. She read constantly, pulling books from whatever shelf she could find, losing herself in stories about people who belonged somewhere. Libraries became her sanctuary, the only places that never asked her to leave. The last foster home was in Allentown. The father was a long-haul trucker who was rarely present. The mother collected porcelain figurines and resentment in equal measure. One freezing night in January, after an argument about a glass of spilled milk, that somehow became an argument about everything Hattie had ever done wrong. She walked out the back door carrying a canvas backpack with 2 shirts, a toothbrush, a copy of Jane Eyre, and $11. Nobody followed her. Nobody called. The silence confirmed what she had always suspected. She was not the kind of person people came looking for. For 3 months, Hattie lived on the margins of a city that barely noticed her. She slept in bus stations until security guards told her to move. She slept in church basements until the shelters filled up. Some nights she slept beneath the 8th Street Bridge, where the steel beams blocked the wind and the river made a sound almost gentle enough to be mistaken for company. She survived on day labor and small mercies. A diner owner who let her wash dishes for cash and a meal. A church volunteer who handed out wool blankets without asking questions. A librarian who unlocked the back door 20 minutes early on cold mornings and pretended not to see the girl sleeping between the biography shelves. One evening in late February, after finishing a shift scrubbing pots at the diner, Hattie stopped at a roadside fruit stand. She had $3 in her pocket. She bought a single apple. It was small, slightly bruised, and unremarkable in every way. But it was hers, and it would be breakfast. Walking back toward the bridge, she noticed an elderly woman sitting alone on a bench near the bus depot. The woman wore a coat too thin for the weather. Her shoes were held together with duct tape. She sat perfectly still, staring at nothing, the way people do when they have run out of places to go. Hattie stopped. She looked at the apple in her hand. She thought about breakfast. She thought about hunger. Then she walked over and placed the apple in the woman's palm without saying a word. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with something Hattie couldn't name. Then she smiled slowly, as though she had just been handed proof that the world still remembered her. Hattie turned to leave. A man's voice stopped her. He was sitting on the opposite bench, an old man with a grey beard and a wool cap pulled low over his ears. She hadn't noticed him before. His voice was calm and hurried, carrying the weight of someone who had watched the world for a very long time. His words reached her across the cold air. The ones who've suffered most get to choose. Become bitter or become a shelter for somebody else. Hattie frowned. She didn't understand what he meant. She was 16 years old and hungry and alone, and philosophy felt like a luxury meant for people who had roofs over their heads. She walked away without responding, but the words followed her. They followed her beneath the bridge that night. They followed her through the next 54 years, and they would be waiting for her on a porch in Virginia half a century later, when she finally understood what they meant. The years between 16 and 70 passed the way years do for people who expect nothing. Quietly, without ceremony. Hattie earned her GED at 19. She worked her way through community college shelving books at a public library, a job that felt less like work and more like returning to the only home she had ever trusted. By 26, she had a degree in library science. By 30, she was a school librarian in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She was good at the work, patient with the children, organized with the catalog, gentle with the books. She spent 38 years behind the same circulation desk, watching generations of students grow up, graduate, and disappear into lives she could only imagine. She never married. There had been a few possibilities: a kind math teacher in her 30s, a widowed neighbor who brought her firewood every November. But each time a relationship grew close enough to matter, something inside Hattie pulled back. Attachment, she had learned long ago, was just a different word for risk. And Hattie Calloway had been hurt enough to know that the safest distance between herself and disappointment was whatever distance she could maintain. She retired at 68. The school gave her a small reception in the cafeteria. There was a sheet cake with her name misspelled. A few colleagues made speeches. The principal presented her with a brass clock she would never wind. Hattie stood at the edge of the room, smiling politely, and felt the same thing she had felt her entire life: gratitude and loneliness, both always at the same time. By 70, she lived alone in a second-floor apartment above a laundromat on Derry Street. Her mornings followed a pattern so precise it had become almost invisible. Coffee at 6, toast with butter at 6:15, a walk to the old library, even though she no longer worked there, just to sit on the bench outside and watch the doors open at 9. Then home. Then a book. Then the slow, reliable silence of an evening that looked exactly like the one before. She had grown used to silence the way a person grows used to a limp. It was always there. It shaped how she moved through the world. But she had stopped noticing it most days. Then the phone rang. It was a Thursday afternoon in early September. The voice on the other end was polite, professional, and slightly awkward, the way people sound when they are about to deliver information they know will not be believed. The man introduced himself as an estate attorney from a town called Ashford in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. He asked if she was Hattie Calloway, born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, previously a ward of the state foster care system. Hattie confirmed each detail with growing unease. Then the attorney said her name, Vivian Ashworth. Hattie waited. The name meant nothing to her. She had never heard it. She had never known anyone named Ashworth. She was certain the man had confused her with someone else. But the attorney continued. Vivian Ashworth had passed away 3 weeks earlier at the age of 88. In her will, she had left her entire estate, a 52-acre apple orchard in the Shenandoah Valley, to one person, Hattie Calloway of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Hattie sat down on the edge of her bed. The mattress creaked beneath her. There was a condition. Hattie had to live on the property for 90 consecutive days. If she left before the period ended, ownership would pass to Vivian's nephew, a man named Preston Ashworth. Hattie's voice came out smaller than she intended. Why 90 days? The attorney paused. Then he answered carefully, as though reading from a note someone had left for him long ago. Miss Ashworth never explained. She only said that if you stayed long enough, you would understand. That night, Hattie sat at her kitchen table for a long time. The apartment felt smaller than usual. The hum of the laundromat below seemed louder. She looked at the walls, the same walls she had been looking at for 4 years, and realized she could not recall a single thing hanging on them. An apple farm, 52 acres, a woman she had never met leaving her everything. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But somewhere beneath the confusion, beneath the doubt, and the logic telling her to ignore the call and continue her quiet, careful life, something else stirred. It was faint, almost unrecognizable, but it was there. Hope. The dangerous kind. The kind she had locked away at 16 and never trusted since. 5 days later, Hattie Calloway loaded 2 suitcases and a box of books into her 15-year-old sedan and drove south. The drive from Harrisburg to the Shenandoah Valley took just under 4 hours, but it felt like crossing into a different country. The highway gave way to 2-lane roads. The roads gave way to farmland. Strip malls disappeared. In their place rose white church steeples, weathered barns, and fields that stretched toward mountains so blue they seemed painted against the sky. Hattie drove with both hands on the wheel the way she always did. She passed through towns with names that sounded like whispered secrets. Woodstock, Edinburgh, Mount Jackson, each one smaller than the last, each one quieter. When she turned onto the gravel road leading to the property, she had to stop the car. Not because anything was wrong, because she needed a moment to breathe. Apple trees lined both sides of the road, hundreds of them, their branches heavy with late-season fruit, the leaves just beginning to turn gold at the edges. Beyond the orchard, the Blue Ridge Mountains rose in soft layered ridges fading from green to gray to the pale blue of distance. A white clapboard farmhouse sat near the center of the property, its wide porch facing the orchard like an open hand. Nearby, an old red barn leaned gently with age, its paint faded, but not gone. The place needed work. That was obvious. Fence posts tilted at odd angles, shutters hung crooked. Weeds pushed through the gravel path leading to the porch steps. But there was something about it, something Hattie could not immediately name. The property did not feel abandoned. It felt patient, as though it had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to arrive. An older man stepped onto the porch as Hattie parked. He was tall, slightly stooped, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His face was weathered in the way faces become when they have spent decades outdoors, not aged so much as deepened. His voice carried across the gravel, warm and unhurried. "You must be Hattie Calloway." Hattie nodded. The man introduced himself as Walter Greer. He had been Vivian's neighbor for more than 40 years and had helped look after the property since her passing. As he carried her suitcases inside, Hattie noticed how often Vivian's name surfaced in his conversation, casually, respectfully. The way people mentioned someone they loved without needing to announce it. The inside of the farmhouse stopped her in the doorway. Everything was exactly as if the owner had simply stepped outside for a walk and hadn't returned yet. A rocking chair beside the fireplace still angled toward the window. Books arranged neatly on shelves, their spines soft with use. A half-finished quilt folded over the arm of a sofa. A pair of reading glasses resting on the kitchen counter beside a tin of loose tea. The house did not feel empty. It felt held, as though every object inside it carried the memory of hands that had placed it there with care. That afternoon, Walter drove Hattie into Ashford for supplies. The town was small, the kind of place where the post office, the diner, and the hardware store all shared the same block. As they walked through the grocery store, a woman in her 70s noticed the farm's address on a receipt Hattie was holding. The woman's face changed immediately. Her voice softened into something close to reverence. Vivian Ashworth's place. She set down the bag of flour she was carrying. That woman paid for my grandson's school books 3 years running when we had nothing." At the diner, an elderly man in a veteran's cap overheard the conversation. He turned toward Hattie with a directness that came from age and earned authority. "If you're connected to Vivian Ashworth, then you're connected to the best person this valley ever produced." He paused, then quieter. "When my wife had cancer, Vivian made sure there was a hot meal on our porch every single night for 7 months. Never once knocked on the door. Never once asked to be thanked." Hattie listened. She listened at the hardware store where the owner described how Vivian had quietly co-signed a loan so he could keep his business open during the recession. She listened at the church where the pastor mentioned a scholarship fund Vivian had established for children in the county foster system. She listened until the listening itself became overwhelming. Everywhere she went, people had a story, not about wealth or ambition, about kindness. Steady, deliberate, anonymous kindness that had been woven so deeply into the fabric of the town that most people only recognized its shape after Vivian was gone. On the drive back to the farm, Hattie stared out the window at the mountains turning purple in the distance. A question had been growing inside her all afternoon, pressing against the inside of her chest like a stone. Why would a woman who had spent her entire life caring for this community leave everything to a complete stranger? That evening, Walter showed Hattie through the rest of the farmhouse. The hallway on the second floor was lined with photographs, dozens of them in mismatched frames covering nearly every inch of the wall. Harvest festivals, church picnics, children laughing beneath apple trees, community dinners with long tables set up in the orchard. In almost every photograph, Vivian appeared, never at the center, always slightly to the side, helping, carrying, pouring, holding a child's hand. Hattie moved slowly along the wall, studying each image. Then she stopped. Near the center of the display, surrounded by photographs on every side, was an empty space. A rectangle of darker wallpaper, where a frame had clearly hung for years, perhaps decades. The nail was still there. The outline was sharp and unmistakable. Hattie turned to Walter. Her voice was quiet. "What was here?" Walter looked at the wall. Something shifted behind his eyes, brief and uncomfortable, like a door closing quickly. Then it was gone. His answer came a beat too late. "I'm not sure." It was gone before I started helping with the house. Hattie studied his face. She had spent 38 years as a school librarian. She had watched children try to hide stolen candy, broken rules, and uncomfortable truths. She knew what a rehearsed answer looked like, and Walter Greer had just given her one. She didn't press him, not yet. Instead, she continued down the hallway and into the small study at the end. The room smelled of old paper and lavender. A writing desk sat beneath the window, its surface bare except for a porcelain cup filled with pencils. Hattie opened the top drawer. Inside, resting on a stack of envelopes, was a journal, leather-bound, dark brown, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. Hattie picked it up carefully. The pages were dense with handwriting, elegant and deliberate, the penmanship of someone who treated each word as something worth preserving. She opened to the first entry. No date, no greeting. Just a single line written in ink that had faded to the color of rust. "Today I searched again and again. I did not find her. But I will not stop." Hattie read the sentence twice, then a third time. The words were simple, but something about them unsettled her. The weight of them. The exhaustion beneath the determination. Whoever Vivian had been searching for, she had been searching for a very long time. Hattie closed the journal and held it against her chest. Outside, the last light of day was disappearing behind the orchard. The apple trees stood in darkening rows, their branches heavy, their silence deep. She carried the journal downstairs and sat on the porch. The rocking chair creaked beneath her. Crickets sang from the tall grass beyond the barn. The mountains were black shapes against a sky turning from violet to ink. Then she heard it, the low rumble of an engine, distant at first, growing louder. Headlights appeared at the end of the gravel road and stopped just inside the property line. A black pickup truck. The engine idled. No one got out. Hattie sat very still. From where she sat, she could see the silhouette of a man behind the wheel. He was not looking at the farmhouse. He was not looking at the orchard. He was looking directly at her. The truck sat there for a full minute, maybe longer. Then the headlights swept across the gravel as the vehicle reversed and pulled away into the darkness. Hattie's hands were still gripping the arms of the rocking chair when Walter's voice came through the screen door the next morning. She described the truck. Walter's face tightened. The warmth in his expression folded into something harder, something protective. His voice came low and steady. That was Preston Ashworth. Hattie waited. Walter stepped onto the porch. He looked toward the orchard for a long moment, as though deciding how much truth the morning could hold. Then he turned back to her. He thought this farm was already his. He's been thinking that for a long time. A pause. And right now he's counting down those 90 days, same as you. Hattie looked at the journal still resting in her lap. She looked at the orchard stretching toward the mountains. She looked at the empty space on the wall upstairs, where a photograph had once hung, and someone had taken it away. She was not just inheriting property. She was stepping into the middle of a story that had been unfolding long before she arrived. A story with missing pages and unanswered questions, and at least one person who wanted to make sure she never read the ending. The morning air smelled of apples. Somewhere in the orchard, a bird called out and received no answer. Hattie Calloway had spent her entire life being the person nobody came looking for. But sitting on that porch with a dead woman's journal in her hands and a stranger's headlight still burning behind her eyes, she understood something for the first time. Someone had been looking for her for a very long time. And whoever that someone was, she had left behind a trail of breadcrumbs hidden inside 90 days. The question was no longer whether Hattie would stay. The question was what she would find if she did. The first morning, Hattie tried to fix the fence along the south pasture. She lasted 40 minutes. The post she was attempting to straighten had been leaning for what looked like years, its base softened by rot and rain. She wrapped both hands around it, braced her feet in the grass, and pulled. The post didn't move. Her lower back did. A sharp electric pain shot from her hip to her shoulder blade, and she sat down hard in the wet grass, breathing through her teeth, staring up at the sky while the fence post continued leaning at exactly the same angle as before. She sat there for a long time. Long enough for the dew to soak through her pants. Long enough for a mockingbird to land on the crooked post and regard her with what she could only describe as professional skepticism. 70 years old, bad knees, a back that announced weather changes before the radio did. And she had somehow agreed to restore a 52-acre farm she knew nothing about in a town where she knew almost no one, while a man in a black truck watched from the road and waited for her to fail. The absurdity of it settled over her like fog. Walter found her there an hour later. He didn't comment on the wet grass stains on her pants or the fence post still listing sideways. He simply set down 2 mugs of coffee, lowered himself onto an overturned bucket nearby, and waited. After a while, Hattie spoke without looking at him. "I don't know what I'm doing." Walter took a sip of his coffee. Then, with the unhurried patience of a man who had spent his life watching things grow at their own pace. Neither did Vivian her first year. She snapped the blade off a brush cutter trying to trim the orchard path, flooded the barn twice, ordered the wrong fertilizer, and nearly killed a whole row of galas. He paused. She figured it out, but not alone, and not fast. He didn't offer to do the work for her. He didn't take the tools from her hands. Instead, he showed her where the ground was softest for new post holes. He explained which fences mattered and which ones could wait. He pointed out the sections of the orchard that needed pruning first, and the ones that were healthy enough to leave alone. He gave her a map. She still had to walk it herself. By the end of the first week, Hattie's hands were blistered in places she didn't know hands could blister. She had bruised her shin climbing into the barn loft. She had spent an entire afternoon trying to unjam a rusted gate latch, only to discover the gate open from the other side. The farm humbled her daily patiently without malice, the way a teacher corrects a student who is trying hard but starting late. And yet something was shifting. Not in the farm, in her. Each evening when she sat on the porch with aching muscles and dirt beneath her fingernails, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Not accomplishment exactly. Presence. She was here. She was doing something that mattered. And for the first time since she could remember, the silence around her didn't feel like absence. It felt like space. The town came to her slowly, the way creeks find their way downhill, not rushing, just following the natural path. It started with Frank Thurman. He was 74, a retired diesel mechanic with enormous hands and a voice that sounded like it had been cured in wood smoke. He showed up one morning unannounced, walked past Hattie without introduction, and spent 3 hours underneath the old tractor in the barn. When he emerged grease-streaked and satisfied, the engine turned over for the first time in 2 years. Hattie stood in the barn doorway, not sure what to say. Frank wiped his hands on a rag and answered her expression before she could form the question. Vivian kept that tractor running for 30 years. Felt wrong to let it sit. Then he left. He came back the next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. He never asked for payment. He never stayed for conversation longer than the work required. He simply showed up, fixed something, and disappeared, leaving behind the quiet evidence that someone had been there. Others followed. A retired school teacher named Della Burgess appeared with 2 blackberry pies and a card that read, "Only welcome home." A young woman from the church brought a box of canning jars and a handwritten guide to apple butter that had been passed through her family for 4 generations. 2 high school boys' brothers knocked on the door one Saturday and asked if there was anything heavy that needed moving. Hattie accepted each offering with the careful gratitude of someone who had never learned how to receive. She thanked people too many times. She offered to pay when payment wasn't wanted. She stood in doorways holding pies she hadn't asked for, blinking against the strangeness of being remembered. One afternoon, as she and Walter repaired a section of the orchard fence, she asked the question that had been circling inside her for days. Why do they keep coming? Walter drove a nail into a crossbeam before answering. His voice was matter-of-fact, the way people speak when they are stating something they consider obvious. Because this farm fed them, not just apples. Vivian hired their kids in summer. She let families speak for free when money was tight. She bought school supplies every August and left them on porches without a note. He straightened up. When someone holds a town together that long, the town remembers. Hattie looked down the row of trees stretching toward the mountain. She was beginning to understand something about the farm that hadn't been in the lawyer's paperwork. The land was measured in acres, but its value was measured in people. That evening, she returned to Vivian's journal. She had been reading it in small portions, a few pages each night, the way a person rations something precious. Most entries were brief: reflections on the orchard, notes about the harvest, observations about weather and wildlife and the slow turning of seasons. But scattered between these ordinary entries were others written in a different ink with a different weight. Entries about searching, about phone calls that led nowhere, about trips to cities in Pennsylvania that ended in closed offices and unanswered questions. One entry dated 11 years before Vivian's death stopped Hattie cold. I found the name in the shelter records, the same city, the same year. She was there. I know she was there, but when I arrived, they told me the child had been transferred. No forwarding information, no record of where she went. I sat in my car in the parking lot for an hour before I could drive home. Hattie's hands trembled against the page. The shelter. The same city, the same year. She read the entry again, then once more. The details were too specific to be coincidence. The city was in Pennsylvania. The year matched a period of Hattie's own childhood, a window of months she had spent in a group shelter before being placed with yet another family. Vivian had been looking for someone in the exact place Hattie had once been, at the exact time Hattie had been there. She closed the journal. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her wrists. The farmhouse settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs. But the silence inside it had changed. It was no longer the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of a room holding its breath before a door opens. The next morning, Hattie drove to the Family Resource Center on the edge of town. She had visited once before briefly during her first week. Now she returned with a different purpose, not curiosity, need. She needed to be useful. She needed to feel the weight of something beyond her own questions. The center was modest, linoleum floors scuffed by years of foot traffic, fluorescent lights that hummed a half tone too high, folding tables arranged in a room that smelled of instant coffee and children's crayons. A handful of volunteers were sorting donated clothing into boxes. In the far corner, 3 children sat at a low table doing homework with the focused intensity of students who understood that no one else was going to help them finish. Hattie watched for a moment, then she pulled up a chair. She spent the rest of the afternoon helping children with reading assignments. Not teaching exactly, just sitting beside them, listening to them sound out words, waiting with the patience that 38 years behind a circulation desk had built into her bones. When a boy stumbled over a passage about a fox and a winter forest, Hattie didn't correct him. She simply read the sentence aloud once slowly and let him try again. By the time she left that evening, something had loosened inside her chest. A tightness she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there. She came back the next day and the day after. Within 2 weeks, the children at the center had begun saving her a seat. It was during one of those afternoons that Karen Whitfield, the center's director, asked Hattie to follow her into the back office. Karen was a practical woman in her 50s, the kind of person who wore reading glasses on a chain and could stretch a donated dollar further than anyone thought possible. She opened an old filing cabinet and pulled out a thick binder. Inside were photographs, dozens of them spanning years, families receiving Thanksgiving baskets, children holding new backpacks on the first day of school, elderly residents gathered around tables at holiday dinners. In photograph after photograph, the same figure appeared in the background, never centered, never posing. A woman with silver hair and careful hands carrying boxes, setting tables, kneeling beside children. Vivian, always present, never asking to be seen. Karen turned the pages slowly. Her voice was quiet, carrying the particular steadiness of someone delivering important information. Most people thought Vivian was just a farmer with a good heart, but the truth is this center existed because of her. School supplies, emergency heating funds, food deliveries in winter, medical bills for families who had no insurance. She closed the binder. More people depended on Vivian Ashworth than she ever wanted anyone to know. Hattie stared at the closed binder. A single thought pressed against everything else. If the farm was sold, the center would lose its foundation. The programs would end. The families who came here because they had nowhere else to turn would have one less place in the world. She drove back to the farm as the sun was setting. The orchard glowed amber and gold. She parked but didn't get out. She sat behind the wheel, both hands resting in her lap, and looked at the rows of apple trees running toward the mountains. She was beginning to understand what Vivian had built. Not a business, not an inheritance. A lifeline. One that stretched invisibly through the entire town, connecting people who might never have known how much they depended on the same quiet source. And she was beginning to understand what losing it would mean. The following week, Hattie made a decision that surprised even herself. She proposed reviving the Apple Harvest Festival, a tradition Ashford had celebrated every autumn for decades, until Vivian's health declined and the event quietly disappeared. She announced the idea at a community meeting in the church hall. The room was full. Farmers, retirees, teachers, shop owners, people who had known Vivian for a lifetime. The moment Hattie spoke the words, something changed in the room. A charge, an energy she had never felt directed toward anything she had done. Hands went up, voices volunteered. Within 3 days, the planning had taken on a life of its own. Local businesses donated supplies. The church offered tables and chairs. Frank Thurman organized a crew to build a small stage beside the barn. Even the children at the resource center made decorations, paper apples painted in reds and golds and hung from string. For the first time in 70 years, Hattie Calloway stood at the center of something. Not at the edge, not behind the desk, not watching through a window, at the center. And the feeling was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. One evening, after a planning meeting, she walked alone through the orchard. The air had turned cooler. Autumn was settling into the valley the way autumn does in the Shenandoah, gently. At first, then all at once, she found herself standing beneath the ancient apple tree near the center of the property. The one with the trunk so thick and twisted, it looked like it had been growing since before the county had a name. The small wooden plaque was still attached to a lower branch. She read the words again, though she already knew them by heart. Some things reveal themselves only to those willing to stay. She rested her hand against the bark. It was rough and warm even in the cooling air. She thought about the girl beneath the bridge, the girl who gave away her only apple, the girl nobody came looking for. Then she corrected herself. Someone had come looking. Someone had spent years searching shelters and records and phone lines trying to find a child the system had swallowed. The question she couldn't yet answer was the simplest one of all. Why she didn't hear the truck until it was already parked near the farmhouse. The engine cut. A door opened and closed. Footsteps crossed the gravel with a deliberateness that announced something other than a friendly visit. Preston Ashworth walked toward her through the orchard rows. He wore a press shirt and clean boots, the kind of boots that had never touched actual farm work. His face carried the same controlled expression she remembered from the night his headlights had found her on the porch, polite on the surface and calculating underneath. He stopped 10 feet away. His eyes moved across the orchard, the newly repaired fences, the freshly cleared paths, the signs of care that had begun reshaping the property. His voice was measured, almost conversational. "You've been busy." Hattie didn't respond. She waited. Preston reached into his jacket and produced a business card. He held it out between 2 fingers. Hattie looked down. A real estate development company. The logo was sleek modern and entirely wrong against the backdrop of apple trees and mountain ridges. His tone shifted just slightly into something that wanted to sound helpful. "They've made an extremely generous offer on the property. More than the land is worth, frankly. You could walk away from all of this with enough money to live very comfortably for the rest of your life." Hattie looked at the card. She didn't take it. Preston continued, his voice still smooth. "You've done admirable work here, but let's be realistic. Maintaining a 52-acre orchard requires resources, equipment, labor. It's not a retirement hobby. It's a full-time operation. And with all respect, it's not something one person can manage, especially at your age." The last 2 words landed precisely where he intended them. Hattie felt them. She felt the truth inside them, too. She was 70. Her knees ached every morning. She had bruises on her arms from work she was still learning how to do. The farm was enormous, and she was one woman. And some nights the sheer scale of what she had taken on pressed against her chest like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. But she also felt something else. Something Preston couldn't see because he had never been forced to develop it. Stubbornness. The particular unbreakable kind that grows inside people who have spent their lives being underestimated. Her voice came out steady and unhurried. "I appreciate you coming all this way, but the farm isn't for sale." Preston's smile thinned. For just a moment the mask slipped and she saw what was underneath. Not disappointment, anger. The cold, compressed anger of someone who had expected to win and was only now realizing the game might be longer than he planned. His voice dropped lower. "You're holding on to something that doesn't belong to you." Hattie met his eyes. She let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to before she answered. "And you're trying to take something that was never yours." Preston stared at her. Neither of them looked away. The orchard stood around them in the fading light. The trees patient and indifferent, the mountains beyond them older than any argument. Then Preston turned and walked back toward his truck. Before he opened the door, he paused. Without turning around, his voice carried across the gravel. "Be careful getting attached, Mrs. Calloway. Attachment is expensive when the ground shifts." The engine started. The headlights swept across the trees. Then he was gone. Hattie stood alone in the orchard for a long time afterward. Her hands were shaking, but not from the cold. 3 days later, she found the filing cabinet. It was in the back corner of the barn's storage room, hidden behind stacked crates and a broken wheelbarrow. A steel cabinet locked its surface, dulled by years of dust. Hattie had walked past it half a dozen times without noticing. But that afternoon, while reorganizing the storage room, she bumped one of the crates and it shifted, revealing the cabinet's edge. She tried the drawers, locked. She found the key on a nail behind the barn door, small and tarnished, exactly where someone who trusted the right person would eventually look, would hide it. Inside the cabinet were folders, dozens of them, each labeled with a name. Families, veterans, widows, children. Every folder contained notes in Vivian's handwriting, not financial records, stories, details of lives Vivian had touched, help she had provided, needs she had quietly met without anyone knowing the full scope. Hattie pulled folder after folder, reading fragments. A boy who needed winter boots. A widow whose furnace broke in February. A family that lost everything to a fire and found groceries on their porch for 6 months afterward. Then her hands stopped. Near the back of the drawer, one folder was thicker than all the others. It was tied shut with a length of faded red ribbon. No name on the tab, just a small symbol drawn in pencil, a circle with a dot in the center, like the core of an apple cut in half. Hattie untied the ribbon. Inside were documents she hadn't expected. Donation receipts to shelters in Pennsylvania. Correspondence with social workers. Letters sent to foster care agencies requesting information about former wards. And a photograph. It was old, creased at the corners, slightly overexposed. A young girl standing outside a brick building. The image was not sharp enough to make out the child's features clearly, but the building behind her was unmistakable. Hattie recognized the entrance, the metal awning, the concrete steps with the crack running diagonally across the second one. She had sat on those steps. She had counted the cracks in that concrete while waiting for a social worker who was always late. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in Vivian's handwriting, 4 words: "Never stop looking." Below the photograph was another document. A printout from a county database dated 14 years ago. A list of children who had passed through that specific shelter during a specific window of time. One name was circled in pencil: Hattie Calloway, age 8. The barn was very quiet. Dust floated in the light coming through the high window. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the apple trees with a sound like slow breathing. Hattie sat on the wooden floor, the folder open in her lap. The photograph of a child she used to be resting against her knee. She didn't cry. She was beyond crying. What she felt was larger than tears, larger than sadness, larger than any single emotion she had a name for. Vivian Ashworth hadn't chosen a stranger. She had been searching for Hattie, specifically, deliberately, for decades. And she had come close enough to find the shelter, close enough to find the records, close enough to circle a name on a page, but not close enough to find the girl herself before time ran out. The 90 days weren't a legal formality. They were Vivian's last chance to give Hattie what she had spent 30 years trying to deliver in person. The answer to a question Hattie had carried since she was 3 years old. You were not forgotten. Someone was always looking. She closed the folder and held it against her chest, the same way she held the journal each night on the porch. The ribbon hung loose over her wrist, faded red against the skin that had aged without anyone watching. Then, in the stillness of the barn, another sound reached her. The crunch of tires on gravel. Not Preston's truck this time. A sedan, official looking. She stepped outside. A man in a gray suit was walking toward the farmhouse carrying an envelope. He introduced himself as an associate from the estate attorney's office. The envelope contained a legal filing. Preston Ashworth had formally challenged Vivian's will. The petition claimed Vivian had been mentally unfit at the time she wrote it. If the challenge succeeded, the 90-day clause would be voided. The farm would transfer to Preston immediately, regardless of whether Hattie stayed or left. Hattie read the document twice. The legal language blurred in front of her eyes, but the meaning was sharp and clear. It didn't matter how many fences she fixed. It didn't matter how many children she read to at the center. It didn't matter that she had found the journal, the photographs, the folder with the red ribbon. Preston was trying to take the farm not by waiting her out, but by erasing the document that brought her here in the first place. That night, the farmhouse felt different. The walls seemed thinner, the silence heavier. Hattie sat at the kitchen table, the legal papers spread before her, the journal open beside them, the red ribbon folder resting underneath. On the table in a small ceramic bowl Vivian had once used for odds and ends sat a single apple from the orchard. Hattie stared at it for a long time. Small, imperfect. A bruise along one side where it had pressed against a branch. She thought about the apple she had given away at 16. She thought about the woman who had smiled as though receiving a treasure. She thought about the old man on the bench, and the choice he said belonged to those who had suffered most. Become bitter or become a shelter. She was 70 years old. Her knees hurt. A man with lawyers and money, and the particular cruelty of someone who had never been denied anything, wanted to take the only thing she had ever been given. And for one long honest moment sitting alone at that table in the dark, Hattie Calloway considered walking away, getting in her car, driving north, returning to the apartment above the laundromat and the silence that while empty had at least been safe. Then she looked at the apple again. She picked it up, turned it in her hand, felt the weight of it small and real and ordinary. And she set it back down, gently, the way you set down something you intend to keep. She was not leaving. She had spent a lifetime walking away from places that didn't want her. This place did. These people did. And somewhere in a leather journal and a folder tied with red ribbon, a woman who had never stopped searching had left behind the proof. Hattie closed the legal papers, folded them neatly, and placed them inside the journal. Tomorrow she would fight. Tonight she would stay. Outside the orchard stood silver under a half moon. The ancient tree at its center held its branches wide the way arms open when someone is finally coming home. Hattie did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table until the darkness outside the windows began to thin, reading the legal filing one more time, then setting it aside and opening Vivian's journal instead. She read slowly the way she had always read, with the attention of someone who understood that the right sentence found at the right moment could change the shape of a life. By dawn, she had made a decision. She was not going to wait for Preston's lawyers to decide her future. Not this time. Not here. That was finished. She drove into Ashford before the diner opened. The attorney's office was on the second floor of a brick building near the post office. She carried the financial documents she had found in the barn, the folders from the locked cabinet, and the red ribbon file. She placed them on the attorney's desk without ceremony and told him everything she had discovered. The donation records, the shelter correspondence, the photograph of herself as a child, and buried among the charitable files, the financial inconsistencies she had noticed weeks ago, withdrawals and transfers bearing Preston Ashworth's name that did not align with any program Vivian had ever authorized. The attorney studied the documents for a long time. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from professional composure to something more personal. The look of a man who had respected Vivian Ashworth and was now seeing for the first time how thoroughly her trust had been violated. He told Hattie the records would need to be reviewed by investigators. It would take time, but the evidence was substantial, and it would almost certainly undermine Preston's claim that Vivian had been mentally unfit. A woman who had maintained meticulous financial records, organized decades of charitable work, and documented every discrepancy in her nephew's handling of foundation funds was not a woman whose judgment could be credibly questioned. Hattie nodded. She did not feel relief, not yet. What she felt was something closer to steadiness, the particular calm that comes from finally doing the thing you were afraid to do and discovering that you are still standing on the other side of it. Word moved through Ashford the way it always does in small towns. Not through announcements, but through conversations at the hardware store, quiet exchanges after church. A sentence passed between neighbors leaning on a fence. By the end of the week, people knew, not the details, just the shape of things. Hattie was fighting for the farm. Preston was trying to take it. And the community that Vivian had spent a lifetime sustaining was being asked without anyone saying it aloud to remember what that sustaining had cost. They responded the only way they knew how. One by one, people walked into the attorney's office and offered to provide testimony. Frank Thurman described 30 years of interactions with Vivian. Her sharpness, her memory, her ability to recall the name of every child who had ever picked apples on her land. Della Burgess brought a stack of handwritten letters Vivian had sent her over the years, each one clear, coherent, and deeply specific. The pastor submitted records of the scholarship fund Vivian had managed single-handedly with accounting so precise it would have satisfied an auditor. Karen Whitfield from the Resource Center provided the most damaging evidence of all. Years of financial reports showing that funds earmarked for community programs had been rerouted through accounts Preston controlled. Payments that never reached their intended recipients. Invoices for services never rendered. A pattern so careful and so gradual that it had gone unnoticed while Vivian was alive, hidden beneath the trust, a small town places in a family name. Hattie did not orchestrate any of this. She did not ask anyone to come forward. They came because the farm had been their shelter. And shelters are worth defending. On the morning of the 89th day, the attorney called. Preston's legal challenge had been withdrawn. No public statement, no confrontation, just a quiet filing with the county court. And by afternoon, a moving truck parked outside the house Preston had been renting in the next town over. By evening, he was gone. The black pickup truck did not appear on the gravel road again. Justice, when it finally came, did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived the way most true things do, slowly, without music, through the accumulated weight of ordinary people telling the truth. The next morning was the 90th day. It was also the morning of the Apple Harvest Festival. Hattie woke before sunrise. The farmhouse was quiet. She dressed slowly, the way a person dresses when they understand that the day ahead will be one they remember for the rest of their life. She made coffee. She stood on the porch. The orchard was wrapped in mist so fine it looked like the valley was breathing. The attorney arrived at 8. He brought a single envelope, thick and sealed with wax, the kind of gesture that belonged to a woman who believed certain things deserved more ceremony than a staple document. Hattie opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a letter, 6 pages written in Vivian's hand. The penmanship was the same as the journal entries, elegant, unhurried. The handwriting of someone who understood that words, once committed to paper, become permanent. The letter began simply. My dear Hattie, if you are reading this, then you stayed. That means you have seen what I spent my life building, and you have understood why it matters. But there is something else I need you to know. Something I could not put in a journal or a legal document. Something that belongs only to you. Hattie's hands were trembling. She continued reading. Vivian wrote that nearly 68 years ago, before the orchard, before Ashford. Before any of it, she had been a young woman living in Scranton, Pennsylvania. She worked at a textile mill. Her closest friend was a woman named Dorothy Calloway, who worked the loom beside hers. They were inseparable for 3 years. They ate lunch together on the mill steps. They walked home together along the river. They dreamed aloud about lives that might carry them beyond the factory floor. Then Dorothy met a man. She fell in love quickly, the way young people sometimes do when love feels like the only escape available. Within a year, she was pregnant. Within 2 years, the man was gone. Dorothy raised her daughter alone, working double shifts, borrowing against wages she hadn't yet earned. Vivian helped however she could, watching the baby, bringing groceries, sitting beside Dorothy, on nights when exhaustion turned into something darker. When the child was 2, Dorothy became ill. The diagnosis was swift and without mercy. She called Vivian to the hospital on a Tuesday evening. The room smelled of disinfectant and cut flowers that were already wilting. Dorothy's request was simple. She held Vivian's hand and asked her to find the child, to make sure she was safe, to never let her disappear into a system that forgot children the moment their paperwork was filed. Vivian promised. Dorothy died 3 days later, and the system moved faster than grief. By the time Vivian contacted social services, the child had already been placed. The first of many placements, each one further from the last, each one harder to trace. Vivian never stopped trying. She moved to Virginia, inherited the orchard from an uncle, built it into something sustainable, and used the income to fund her search. She donated to shelters. She wrote letters to agencies. She hired investigators when she could afford them. She drove to Pennsylvania dozens of times following leads that turned cold the moment she arrived. 30 years. 30 years of searching for one child who kept moving, kept being moved, kept slipping through the gaps in a system designed to process, not to remember. I found your name in a database 14 years ago, Vivian wrote. I found the shelter you had lived in. I drove there. But you were already gone, transferred to another county. No forwarding record. I sat in the parking lot and wept because I had been so close and the system had taken you from me again the way it had been taking you since you were 2 years old. Hattie set the letter down. She pressed both palms flat against the table. The kitchen was very still. The morning light had shifted from gray to gold, and it fell across the pages in a long, warm stripe. She picked the letter up again. I never met you, Hattie. That is the great sorrow of my life. I made a promise to your mother, and I was not able to keep it the way I intended. But I kept it the only way I could. I gave to every shelter I found, hoping that somewhere in some small way the kindness might reach you even if I could not. And when I finally learned where you were, I was too ill to travel, too weak to knock on your door and explain. So I did what I could. I left you the farm. I left you 90 days. And I trusted that if you stayed long enough, you would find what I had been trying to give you your entire life. Proof that you were never forgotten, that someone always loved you, that your mother's last thought was of you, and her last wish was that someone would hold on and never let go. Hattie read the final line. The farm is yours now, but it was always meant to be yours, because you are Dorothy's daughter, and Dorothy was the best friend I ever had. Something inside Hattie that had been locked for 70 years opened. Not violently, not with a sound. It opened the way a window opens on the first warm morning after a long winter, slowly. And then, all at once, letting in air that had been waiting on the other side for longer than anyone could measure. She wept. She wept at the kitchen table with her hands pressed against the letter, with the morning light moving across the floor, with the smell of coffee growing cold, and the distant sound of people arriving at the orchard for the festival. She wept for the girl beneath the bridge, for the child in the shelter, for the mother she had never known, and for the woman who had spent 30 years trying to keep a promise made in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and dying flowers. Inside the envelope beneath the letter was one more thing, a photograph. It was old, its edges soft with handling, its colors faded to the amber tones of another era. Two young women standing beneath an apple tree, their arms around each other, their faces bright with the kind of joy that belongs to people who do not yet know what the future holds. On the left, a woman Hattie had come to know through journals and stories and the testimony of an entire town. On the right, a woman she had never seen before but recognized immediately, because the shape of her eyes, the angle of her jaw, and the way she tilted her head slightly to the left were exactly the same as the face Hattie saw every morning in the mirror. She turned the photograph over. Vivian's handwriting one final time. For Dorothy's daughter, the one I searched for all my life. Hattie carried the photograph upstairs. She walked to the hallway wall. She placed the picture in the empty space where it had hung for years before someone, perhaps Vivian herself, had removed it and sealed it in the envelope, saving it for the day the right person would stand in this hallway and understand. The frame fit perfectly. The wall was complete. By noon, the orchard was full. More people came than anyone had planned for. Families spread blankets beneath the apple trees. Children chased each other. Between the rows, their laughter rising and falling with the breeze. Local musicians played fiddle and guitar on the small stage beside the barn. The resource center had set up tables offering food and information, and volunteers wearing hand-painted apple pins moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were. The afternoon light turned the valley gold. The mountains beyond the orchard stood in soft blue layers, each ridge slightly paler than the one before, as though the landscape itself was breathing outward toward the horizon. The air smelled of cider and cut grass, and the faint sweetness of fruit warming in the sun. Near sunset, Walter climbed onto the stage. He tapped the microphone once and the crowd settled into the kind of attentive silence that only comes when people trust the person speaking. His voice was steady but not untouched. Vivian Ashworth spent her whole life taking care of this town. Most of you know that. What you might not know is that she spent just as many years trying to keep a promise to a friend, a promise she almost didn't get to keep. He paused, but she found a way, because that's what Vivian did. She always found a way. He turned toward Hattie, who was standing near the edge of the stage, not quite part of the crowd, not quite separate from it. His voice carried across the orchard with a simplicity that needed no decoration. One person chose to stay, and because she stayed, everything Vivian built has a future. The applause began quietly the way rain begins, then grew until it filled the space between the trees. Hattie stepped forward. She had not prepared words. She had spent a lifetime choosing silence because silence was safer. But standing in front of these faces, each one connected to a chapter of the last 90 days, she understood that some silences are not safety. They are surrender. And she was done surrendering. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be, "I came here believing I was inheriting a farm." But Vivian left me something that no deed or document could ever hold. She looked across the orchard, across the faces, across the years. She left me proof that I was never alone. And she left all of us a reminder that kindness doesn't disappear. It multiplies. It just needs someone willing to keep it going. The crowd was quiet, not the silence of absence, the silence of people holding something together. That night, after the last car had pulled away, and the lantern strung between the trees cast warm circles on the grass, Hattie walked alone to the ancient apple tree at the center of the orchard. The sky above was clear, filled with more stars than she had ever seen from her apartment window in Harrisburg. The air was cool and smelled of apples and earth, and the particular sweetness of autumn in the Shenandoah. A sweetness that seemed to come not from any single thing, but from everything at once. She placed her hand against the bark. The plaque was still there, its letters worn but legible in the moonlight. Some things reveal themselves only to those willing to stay. She understood now, not just the words, the woman who had written them, the promise behind them, the lifetime of searching that had led to this exact moment. An old woman standing beneath an old tree on land that had been waiting for her since before she knew it existed. She was not the girl beneath the bridge anymore. She was not the child no one came looking for. She was Hattie Calloway, Dorothy's daughter, Vivian's choice, and the keeper of an orchard that had never really been about apples at all. The next morning, before the mist had lifted from the valley, Hattie carried a small burlap-wrapped sapling to the base of the ancient tree. She knelt in the cool grass, her knees protesting the way they always did, and dug a hole in the soft earth with her bare hands. She placed the young tree into the ground and pressed the soil around its roots firmly, gently, the way you hold something you intend to protect for a very long time. The sapling was barely 2 feet tall. Beside the ancient tree, it looked impossibly small, but it was planted, and it would grow. Hattie stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and looked across the orchard. Morning light was spilling over the ridge, catching the mist, turning the valley the color of honey. A single bird called from somewhere deep among the rows. One apple given away on a frozen night 54 years ago. One promise kept across 3 decades. One farm waiting at the end of a long and patient search. And now a new tree, small and ordinary and full of time, growing beside the one that had been standing there all along. If this story stayed with you tonight, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you discovered that someone had been looking out for you all along, even when you didn't know it? And if you haven't already, subscribe so you'll be here for the next story. Good night.